this title here, Be Rich, this actually comes from a single letter that Paul wrote to his student Timothy. Now, he wrote this years and years after Christ had left, and he wrote it to Timothy, and in it, he's giving all kinds of special things to say to Timothy about how Timothy should lead the crew that's around him. And in particular, Paul says in chapter 6, verses 17 and 18, he starts to tell what he would want Timothy to say to the wealthy among him. And he says it this way. We're going to put it up on the screen just so you can see it. He says, command those who are rich in this present world, those who have some means about them. And he's being literal. Those who have means, command those particular people to do good and to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. So right there, that's where we get our phrase, be rich. Because Paul says we should all be rich. Now, I know none of us would like to admit that we're rich in the room. That's okay. We all want to aspire to be rich, right? So one day when you get out there and you actually become rich, because none of us are there yet. We're never arriving at that. But one day when we get there, we want to be rich. And here's the important part. And this is what I love about this passage. Paul says we want to be rich in good deeds, and he sort of pushes us to this point where we would say we need to practice what it means to be rich in good deeds. And that's what this month is all about. Practicing how to be rich with what God has given to us. So all month we're going to do that. And the first way to practice, and I've always found this to be the case with churches, the first way that we can practice really well is when we as a church discover that we're partners, not competitors. Now, this is really important because most churches don't get this quite right. We go into a community, even if it's a new church plant, and as we settle into the community, we see needs that are all around us, and what do we do as the church? We try to figure out how to solve those needs, don't we? And when we do, that's with the best intentions. That's amazing that we've done that, but here's the problem. As soon as we're the ones who are trying to meet all the needs in the area, we immediately become competitors instead of partners with those around us. And what we want to focus on this month is not how we can be competitors with our neighbors, but if we're going to be rich in good deeds, we need to broaden our base and become partners with those who are around us. And so what we've decided to do, I've met with the chairs of our NOW committee, which is our Nurture, Outreach, and Witness Committee chairs, and we found 2 organizations in our community. They're not falling apart, they're not falling in, they're not kind of crashing, but they are doing incredible work in our community. And we've decided that 10% of every single offering that we take this month will go towards those organizations. The first organization we've decided to help is Youth Empowerment. The second one is the Rutherford Housing Partnership. And both of these organizations are doing incredible things. And let me say just a quick word about both. I've talked to both the directors. The Youth Empowerment is consistently helping middle school and high school students in this community who there's kind of a gap in care. They're creating after-school programs. They're creating recidivist programs that will help them. Their moral recidivist programs, so they're teaching them how to act morally and turning that around so that when they see these kids who are at risk, they'll be able to help them quicker. So we're seeing that. The other one that I just found, this is amazing. You can go watch the YouTube videos later, but anybody in the room heard of the Women Roofers? I heard the Women Roofers. This is a Rutherford County hometown thing, right? But this all started with a Sunday school class that decided to do more good. And wouldn't you know it, when they showed up one Saturday morning to put a roof on a house, the gentleman who was there, the skilled labor, he showed up, he had everything ready to go, and the Sunday school class was invited. And who showed up from this Sunday school class? The women. That's right. Now, there were men in that Sunday school class. You better believe it. But it was all the women who showed up. And from that place, they started this Women Roofers thing. And we want to help these people because they're doing more good in our community. And if we want to take a step towards becoming partners instead of just competitors, then that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to talk at the end today about how we can do that. But here's why. Every church in our community is known for something. They are. You can look around at any church in the community and say, tell me about this church. And in one line, you would be like, oh, that's the church that. Oh, that's the church that believes this. Oh, that's the church that has music that's like that. Oh, that's the church that's always doing this. Oh, that's the church. I went by a church last night. I'll forevermore refer to it as the church that has the old-time fair, right? I don't know anything else that they do in the community, but after seeing it last night, that is the church that does the old-time fair, and they do it big, right? I wouldn't get on that Ferris wheel if you paid me $1,000, but it's out there, and people did. But it is now known to me as that church. And every single church in our community has that type of reputation. There's something about us. And I think if someone came to me and said, what type of reputation would you like your church to have? What type of reputation? If someone were to ask us, what is Salem Church like? Every single time, here's what I would do. I would choose our generosity over every other thing that we could offer. Over everything we could offer. Our music, our worship style, our beautiful sanctuary. Like, I would choose us to be generous every single time. Over anything we do. Why? Because radical, no-strings-attached generosity, that type of generosity that we're going to read about in Scripture in just a minute, is actually what radically changed the ancient world. It's this radical, no-strings-attached generosity that transformed everything. It was powerful. It tore down walls in the ancient world. It's this no-strings generosity that did that. And I'm not coming to you from like this position of not having any theological basis. At our core, many of us know one scripture out of the entire New Testament. It's John 3:16. And what does John 3:16 say? For God so loved the world that he gave. So this doesn't come from nowhere. It comes deeply embedded in what we understand our faith to be. It comes from a God who gave. It was his radical generosity that transformed everything in the world, and he calls us to be a people who look like him. And what he did he respect anything in return for what he did? No. It was this no-strings-attached generosity. He gave, and he allowed the response to be up to us. And I would be all right. I'm going to be honest with you. I'd be all right if I went up to somebody and said, or someone said to our church, I don't really want to be one, but I would love to hire a bunch of those people. I don't necessarily want to be one, but I would love to work with one of those people. I don't necessarily want to be one of them, but I'd let one of them marry my daughter or my son. Like, if you get to that status, that's huge status right there, right? I'm serious. If I could say, if someone in our community would say, I don't necessarily want to be there, but my gosh, I would not want to see our community without them. Because they're the most generous, full-hearted people that I have ever met, and they are doing everything they can to transform the world around them. And Rutherford County would not be the same without them. If you said that to me, I'd say we've landed. You don't have to tell me that we do an old-timey fair incredibly well. You don't have to tell me that we do chicken pie sales well. But if you tell me this is the most incredibly generous group of people who will do whatever to make our community better, we've won. Because that's what God did for us. Because God so loved the world that he first gave. It's no strings attached generosity that's the hallmark of the first century. Before they ever hammered out their theology, they locked in on their generosity. Before they ever hammered out their worship styles and practices, they locked in on their generosity. They had that embedded. And this is a little bit ironic because Christians back then, whether you know it or not, they were poor people. They didn't have anything. In fact, they often found themselves kicked out of towns in areas where no one else would go, and that's where they settled down because they were so odd. They didn't have a voice. They didn't have anything going on. They couldn't get jobs because people thought they were in a cult. They leave the cities, go into these poor rural areas. They had nothing, but they locked in on their generosity in an amazing way before they did anything else in spite of what they didn't have. And here's the truth. They took their cues straight from Christ. From his message, his life, his teachings. I mean, think about the stories like the Good Samaritan. This story where Jesus says, hey, there's a person who's been beat up and he's stranded on the side of the road. Who's going to help him? Who's my neighbor? And the people who were closest to him, the people who looked the most like him, they came by and they just kept walking on by. But this person, this radically transformed Samaritan, this person who was racially persecuted against, he comes up and he is the one who reaches out. He discovers who his neighbor is. He discovers that the person, if this was a different situation, when the Samaritan walked up to the man who was beaten on the side of the road, if he was healthy and wealthy and everything was going well for him, he probably wouldn't have turned to him twice. That the Samaritan reaches out to him with generosity. And Jesus, I love this one final story, and then we'll get to our scripture. I'm going to get there. For those of you who are new, sometimes it takes me a little while, but I'm going to get there. There's this story of Jesus when he's meeting with his disciples in John chapter 13. One of the last nights that he's with his disciples, he sits down after the meal. He takes his rabbinical garb off. And he sits down and he starts to wash their feet. And you can just see the gasps and hear the gasps all over the room as people are seeing what Jesus is doing. But he gets down in the lowest position possible to wash the feet, to give of himself to them. Why does he do it? Because he understood that when you're the most powerful person in the room, you leverage your power for those who are less powerful in the room. For those of you who walk into a room and you know that you're the most powerful person in that room, you've been given that power. You've been esteemed that authority so that you can leverage your power for the people who are less powerful than you in the room. This is what Jesus teaches us when he gets down on his knees and washes the feet of the disciples who are there. But his teachings at times, they're incredibly direct. And that's what I love here in this passage in Luke chapter 6. This morning, Jesus says to his disciples, and I'm just going to read you a few verses very quickly, chapter 6, verse 32. As Luke spells this story out, he says to us, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. I mean, if you think that you're going to get like a cookie just because you love the person who loves you, like, big deal. Sinners do that all day long. And he doesn't stop there. He goes on. He says, look, if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit's that to you? Even sinners do that. Come on, give me a break. Everybody knows that that's what you're supposed to do. And he continues, if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit's that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. And so many of us in this room are kind of like, well, I've heard this story time and time again. It makes sense to me. We should do good for those who don't even do good to us. But that's because we've grown up in this Christian culture. But imagine being in the first century. In the first century, the idea of generosity was held under this term that we're going to put up on the screen. It's called liberalitas. It means giving to please the recipient with the hopes that the recipient would return the favor. You see, giving in the ancient world was given in this way. It gave with the assumption that you would give back. In fact, if you could give before someone gave to you, you would ensure that they would get you back one day. It's this. We have this phrase, don't we? It's you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, right? Or I don't know if it's I'll scratch. I don't know which way. You get what I'm saying, right? We have this phrase that circulates in our tradition today and in our world today, but we don't like to think of it that way. But this is how the ancient world worked. In fact, what's amazing is we have stories of the emperors going down the streets of Rome on a horse and throwing out coins. These coins that are going out. And on the coin is stamped this term right here, liberalitas. Why? Because the emperor is saying, I am giving to you, but I expect your allegiance in return to me. I'm giving you these gifts, but I expect something back from that. And here's what happened in that culture. The people who had the most received the most, didn't they? Because if I'm going to give to somebody, I'm going to give to somebody who can give back more than what I gave to them. I'm not going to give to someone who can't give back to me at all. But when Jesus stepped on the scene, he transformed all of this. Jesus walked into the culture and said, in my kingdom, you give without expectation of return. In my kingdom, you lend knowing that you may never get anything back in return. In my kingdom, you do for others what they cannot do for you. He flips it upside down. He goes on in the story and he says, but love your enemies. I mean, you want to talk about somebody who can't do anything for you. These people won't do anything for you. Love your enemies. Do good to them and lend to them without expectation of getting anything back. They're not going to pay you back anyways. They're your enemies. But I want you to go to them and reach out to them because you know that not only, maybe in some cases they can't give back to you, but they won't give back to you. And I want you to give to them. Listen to what he says next. He says, then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because, and this is huge, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Jesus says, I want to change this giving paradigm. I want to change everything that you've understood about the world. When you think of giving and generosity, you often think in terms of this liberalitas, which says, I give so that you can give back. But Jesus says in these words, do good for those who can't or won't do anything good for you. He did this so that he could switch the giving script up. So he changed it from this term, and you know this term. We use this term all the time. He switched it from liberalitas to caritas, or charity. This is where we get the word charity today. He changed it over. The giving paradigm should shift from liberalitas to a charity, a giving to relieve physical or financial distress without expecting anything in return for it. He completely flips this upside down. And this became the hallmark of the Christian church. This is what set them apart from everybody else. This was all they had to go on at the end of the day. When plagues ripped through the first century and towns, pagan leaders were leaving towns, and everybody was leaving towns because the plagues were coming in. Guess who was going into the town? The Christians. Everybody else has evacuated the town, and the Christians, who can only camp out on the outskirts of the city, have picked up everything they have, and they know there are dying people in there who will die and starve to death because everybody else decided to leave, and Christians went into the towns. They nursed those families back to health. They brought their neighbors, brought things to their neighbors. When the pagans left, the Christians stayed or came back. When the plague was over, what we found happening one after another was that pagans began to convert to Christianity. Why? Because the radical generosity that they were shown in those moments. We even have stories about this. Some of you may know this guy, but he's a guy that I read a lot while I was going through seminary. His name is St. Pachomius. He's an Egyptian monk. He lived out in the middle of nowhere for a long time of his life, but he started an entire branch of Christianity. And Pachomius actually started as a slave in the Roman army. He was stolen from his family, and a lot of times in these periods of time, they would steal people and put them in prison so that they wouldn't leave the army. This is how they drafted. They would draft and put them in, and then they'd put them in prison. Well, a plague came through, and famine started falling in the land. And so they were letting these prisoners die one after another. And then one day, Pachomius is in his cell, and all of a sudden the doors open and the light comes in, and there's a group of people that he's never seen before. He doesn't know who they are. They look kind of weird. And as they come in, they start handing out food. They don't ask for anything. They don't even tell them who they are. They just give them the food and they leave. And day after day, this starts happening. And Pachomius starts to regain his strength along with everyone else. And as he goes on, he starts to ask the guards who are there, because they're giving the guards food as well. He says, "What's going on? Who are these people?" And the guards would say, "Oh, those are the people of the way. They follow this path. Some people call them Christians. I mean, it's this strange thing, but that's who these are." And Pachomius serves his time, and he gets out. And as soon as he gets out, he goes to find these people. And he starts to ask them about what they're doing. And it's because of their generosity to him in the midst of his prison, he couldn't offer anything to them, that Pachomius became a Christ follower. Not because of their theology, not because he ever got to sit in one of their church services and figure out what they believed. Because of their generosity, he followed them. And he became one of the greatest leaders in the ancient church. And in fact, we've got other stories, and I can't tell you them all, but I want to give you this one quote because I love it, I love it, I love it. Early in Christian history, Christianity was made legal by, and many of you know this, by Emperor Constantine. And then shortly after Constantine died, another emperor named Julian took over, and he didn't like the Christians. And so he tried to take things back to the way they were. But he got frustrated. And he got frustrated because the Christians just kept popping up everywhere. He did everything he could to kind of squelch them. And we have this letter that he writes to some of the pagan priests. And here's what he says. This is so beautiful. The Emperor Julian says, "The impious Galileans," who are the Christians, "support not only their poor, but ours as well." He's like, we try to kill them out, but now they're not only helping their own people, but they're helping ours as well. They're doing more things for our people than the pagan priests are doing for our people. And when they do that, everybody turns to them. And he's just frustrated with this. It's because the Christians believed in this radical, no-strings-attached generosity, and it became the hallmark of who they would be in the world. And it's really one of the only reasons that Christianity survived the first century. It's how it survived, it's how it grew, it's how it thrived, and it's how it's landed here today. This is the compassion that is a tangible reflection of a central idea that lies in our gospel message. God so loved that he gave. This central principle that God so loved you and me, no strings attached, I don't care if you do respond, I'm going to love you so much I give. I'm going to love you so much knowing that there's no way for you to give back to me. You will never be good enough. You'll never do anything enough to give back to me. I'm going to give, no strings attached. And there was a group of people who believed that they could be called the children of God, and when they believed that they could become the children of God, they would start to look like that God, which means we would give with no strings attached. We would generously pour out ourselves to everyone we came in contact with. And that's what Be Rich is all about. we want to intentionally set ourselves up this month. This month, it's the month of Thanksgiving. We're naturally sort of programmed as Americans to think this way during November. But here's how I want to do it. There are 3 things that we're going to do. We're going to do some giving, some serving, and some food driving. And food driving is just because I like participles, and without it, it would sound weird. So giving, serving, and food driving. We're going to give. Every single week, we're going to give 10% of what comes in our offerings to one of these 2 organizations. Either the Rutherford Housing Project, which is in particular the women's roofers that we're going to help there, or we're going to help youth empowerment. We're going to give and believe that God will bring the increase, but we're going to give to them. And here's what I would love to challenge us to do. I would love, over the course of this month, if we're taking 10% of all of our giving, I would love for us to hit a point where we could give $2,000 to these organizations. To say, we are with you and behind you. And that means we're going to have to give and really, really give hardcore every single week if we're going to make that goal. But I want us, and I believe we can give in this way to see good things happen for these 2 organizations. And not only do we give, but we serve. And in fact, I mentioned earlier, but tomorrow is a perfect time to serve. On average, we have about 115 people who come to church here. If we each gave an hour, that would give us about 115 hours. But I want to push us. I want to see if we can get 200 hours of total service for our congregation. 200 hours of total service back to the community sometime this month where you would say, my family's going to give an hour or 2 here. My family's going to give an hour or 2 here. And we are going to serve those who are around us. Tomorrow, we could knock out easily 60 or 80 of those hours just in the food drive in the morning if we showed up, because it's 3 hours of serving together. If we had 30 people there, we would blow this out the water. So even tomorrow, starting at 8:30, if we gathered together, we would be a big chunk down. But all throughout the month, I want you to give and find opportunities to give. You can give at the Outreach Center just over here, Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, if you're able to join them and give back in that way. And then as we come in, there'll be cards where you can kind of report, hey, my family did this week. Just drop those in the offering plate and let us know how you've served this week so we know how many hours that we're up to each and every week. And then finally, we're going to be food driving. You know this if you've been here longer than I do this. I don't know this all that well because I've never lived through it, but you've lived through it. We give out turkeys every single year to our community. And this year, most times, and I'll just say this really quick, the Chase Food Bank down on the south end of the town, they often do this as well. This year, they're not doing it. Is that right? They're not going to be able to do this year. But those families are still going to need food. And I want to raise the bar for us. I'm going to set the tangible goal that we as a congregation will provide the 115 turkeys that we need. That's what we're going to commit to. There'll be other food that comes in from Second Harvest. There's other things that we could do. But I want us to commit as a congregation to say, you know what, that need is there. We can hit the 115. We're going to bring those turkeys here. And in fact, that's going to happen next Sunday. So next Sunday when you get here for worship, we're going to have a trailer out front. You'll be able to bring your turkeys with you to church, drop those turkeys in the trailer, and we're going to believe that we can get all those 115 turkeys next week as we do our food driving. Giving, serving, and food driving. These are the ways that we're going to come together and demonstrate to our community that it's not about just what we believe. That's important. That's super important. That's driving us. It's not about just how we worship on Sunday morning. Ultimately, radical Christianity is all about a radical, no-strings-attached generosity that says, I will give because there's a God in heaven who's transformed me and given to me.